It all started with a gut feeling, that nagging sensation in the pit of your stomach that something isn't right, even when everything seems fine on the surface. My wife, Sarah, had always been the kind of person who wore her emotions on her sleeve. She was vibrant, full of life, and her laughter used to fill our home like music. But over the past few months, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, little things that I brushed off as stress or fatigue. She'd come home late from work more often, claiming overtime or last-minute meetings. Her phone, which used to sit carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. And then there were the trips. It started with one weekend away with her girlfriends. I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone needs a break now and then, right? But then it became a pattern. Every few weeks, she'd pack a bag, kiss me goodbye, and head off for another girls' trip. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore the little voice in the back of my mind whispering that something wasn't right. I tried to push the doubts aside. After all, we'd been together for years. We'd built a life together, shared dreams, and weathered storms. I trusted her, or at least I thought I did. But trust is a fragile thing, and once it starts to crack, it's hard to ignore the fractures. The day she left for her latest trip, I hugged her goodbye at the door, pretending everything was normal. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. As I watched her drive away, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. It wasn't just the usual loneliness that came with her being gone. It was something deeper, something darker. I spent the first day trying to distract myself. I cleaned the house, caught up on work, and even went for a long run to clear my head. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, the silence felt suffocating. I found myself replaying every conversation, every interaction, looking for clues I might have missed. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed answers, even if I wasn't ready to face what they might be. I started small, going through her side of the closet, looking for anything out of the ordinary. At first, I felt guilty, like I was betraying her trust by invading her privacy. But the more I searched, the more justified I felt. It didn't take long to find the first red flag. A receipt for a fancy dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of, dated on a night she'd claimed to be working late. My heart sank as I stared at the piece of paper, my mind racing with possibilities. I told myself it could be innocent, maybe a work dinner or a celebration with friends. But deep down, I knew better. I kept digging, my hands trembling as I opened drawers and sifted through her belongings. That's when I found her laptop. She'd always been protective of it, never letting me use it or even look at the screen when she was working. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the power button. This felt like crossing a line, but I was too far gone to turn back now. When the screen lit up, I was surprised to find it wasn't password protected. It was almost like she didn't expect anyone to look. I clicked through her files, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, everything seemed normal work documents, photos of us, the usual stuff. But then I stumbled on a folder labeled MISC. My stomach churned as I opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Photos of her and a man I didn't recognize. They were laughing, holding hands, kissing. My vision blurred as I scrolled through them, each one feeling like a punch to the gut. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there in front of me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And why? Why would she do this to us? To me? By the time she was supposed to come home, I was a mess. I didn't know how to confront her, or even if I should. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to go back to the way things were before, but another part of me knew that wasn't possible. The trust was broken, and there was no going back. When I heard her key in the lock that night, my heart raced. I didn't know what I was going to say or do, but I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The days she was gone felt like an eternity. Every hour dragged on, each minute filled with a mix of dread and determination. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the storm of thoughts raging in my mind. The images from her laptop were burned into my memory. Her smile, his face, the way they looked at each other. It was like a movie playing on a loop, and I couldn't hit pause. I spent the first night after my discovery sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the wall. The room felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. The photos on the dresser, the clothes in the closet, even the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It all felt like a lie. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, some way to make sense of what I'd found. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't sit around waiting for her to come home and explain herself. I needed to know more. I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. So, I started digging. I began with her phone, and she'd always been so protective of it, never letting it out of her sight. But now that she was gone, I had access. I scrolled through her messages, my stomach twisting with every word I read. There were texts from him, flirty, intimate, full of promises and plans. They talked about meeting up, about how much they missed each other, about how they couldn't wait to be together again. It was like reading a script for a romance I wasn't part of. Next, I went through her emails. I found confirmations for hotel bookings, receipts for gifts I'd never seen, and even a few flight itineraries for trips I didn't know she'd taken. Each piece of evidence felt like a knife to the heart, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see it all, to understand the full scope of what she'd been hiding. The hardest part was finding the pregnancy test. It was tucked away in the bottom of her suitcase, still in its box. My hands shook as I held it, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it mine? Or was it his? The thought made me sick to my stomach. I didn't want to believe it, but the timing didn't add up. We hadn't been intimate in weeks, and even then, we'd been careful. As the days went on, I became consumed by my search for the truth. I barely slept, barely ate. I felt like a detective in my own life, piecing together clues that painted a picture I didn't want to see. But the more I found, the harder it became to deny the reality of what was happening. By the time she was supposed to come home, I was a wreck. I hadn't showered in days, hadn't spoken to anyone. I just sat in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal, waiting for her to walk through the door. I didn't know what I was going to say or do, but I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. When I finally heard her car pull into the driveway, my heart started pounding. I could hear her footsteps on the porch, the jingle of her keys as she unlocked the door. I stayed in the kitchen, my back to the entrance, trying to steady my breathing. The moment she walked in, I turned to face her. Her smile faded the second she saw me, replaced by a look of shock and guilt. She froze in the doorway, her suitcase still in hand, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was deafening, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with an explanation, trying to figure out how much I knew. Finally, I broke the silence. I told her the trip was canceled, my voice calm but firm. Her confusion was evident, but so was her panic. She asked about her phone and laptop, her voice trembling as she tried to sound casual. I told her they were in the safe. Her face paled, and she demanded to know why. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked her straight in the eyes and told her to lift her dress. The color drained from her face. She hesitated, her voice shaking as she tried to protest, but I didn't back down. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that I knew everything. In that moment, everything became clear. The lies, the secrets, the betrayal, it all came crashing down around us. And as she stood there frozen in the kitchen, I knew our life together would never be the same. The moment she walked into the kitchen and saw me standing there, the air in the room shifted. It was like time slowed down, every second stretching out as her face went through a series of emotions. Shock, guilt, fear, and then a desperate attempt to regain control. She wasn't expecting me to be home. She thought I'd be gone, that she'd have time to slip back into her routine, to hide whatever evidence she needed to hide. But I was there, waiting, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. I didn't say much at first. I just stood there, watching her, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. She tried to play it cool, asking why I was home, why I hadn't left for work like I usually did. But her voice wavered, and her hands trembled as she set her suitcase down. I could see the panic in her eyes, the way she was scrambling to come up with a story, an excuse, anything to explain why I was standing there, calm and collected, with her phone and laptop locked away in the safe. When I told her the trip was canceled, her confusion was genuine. She didn't understand what I meant, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the photos, the messages, the receipts, and the pregnancy test. I remembered all the lies, all the times she'd looked me in the eye and told me she loved me, all the times she'd kissed me goodbye and walked out the door to be with him. She asked about her phone and laptop, her voice rising with panic. I told her they were in the safe, and her face went pale. She demanded to know why, her tone shifting from fear to anger, but I didn't answer. Instead, I looked her straight in the eyes and told her to lift her dress. The room went silent. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the words to protest. Her voice trembled as she asked if I was kidding, but I didn't flinch. I repeated myself, my tone calm but firm. Either she did it herself, or I would. Her choice. I could see the realization dawning on her face, the understanding that I knew everything. Her hand shook as she reached for the hem of her dress, her movements slow and hesitant. She kept her eyes on the floor, unable to look at me as she lifted the fabric, revealing the truth she'd been trying so hard to hide. In that moment, everything became clear. The pregnancy test, the photos, the messages, it all made sense. She had left for a girls' trip and come back pregnant with another man's child. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the cheating, though that was bad enough. It was the lies, the manipulation, the way she'd looked me in the eye and told me she loved me, all while carrying someone else's baby. I didn't say anything as she stood there, her dress bunched up in her hands, her face pale and tear-streaked. I didn't need to. The truth was written all over her face, in the way she couldn't meet my eyes, in the way her body trembled with fear and shame. Finally, I broke the silence. I told her to sit down, my voice cold and detached. She obeyed without a word, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she was bracing herself for whatever came next. I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I didn't even cry. I just stood there, looking at her, trying to process everything that had happened. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was a stranger to me now. And as much as it hurt, I knew there was no going back. I told her we were done. There was no discussion, no argument, no chance for her to explain herself. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her apologies, her promises to change. It was too late for that. The trust was gone, and without trust, there was nothing left to save. She started to cry then, her sobs filling the silence of the kitchen. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance, but I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching her, feeling nothing but emptiness. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting at the table, her tears falling onto the wood surface. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure, our life together was over. And as much as it hurt, I also knew it was the right thing to do. I deserved better than lies and betrayal, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur. I moved through them like a ghost, going through the motions but feeling completely detached from everything around me. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a hollow shell, a reminder of everything I had lost. I couldn't stand to be in the same room as her, so I spent most of my time locked in the spare bedroom trying to process the storm of emotions raging inside me. The hardest part was the silence. We barely spoke to each other, and when we did, it was only about practical matters, bills, schedules, the logistics of separating our lives. There was no anger, no shouting, no dramatic outbursts, just a cold, heavy silence that hung between us like a wall. It was almost worse than the confrontation itself. At least then there had been some kind of release, some kind of clarity. Now there was nothing but emptiness. I couldn't stop thinking about the pregnancy. It was like a dark cloud hanging over everything, a constant reminder of her betrayal. I didn't know what to do with that information, how to process it. Part of me wanted to pretend it didn't exist, to push it out of my mind and focus on moving on. But another part of me couldn't let it go. I needed to know for sure, to have concrete proof that the child wasn't mine. So I made her take a DNA test. It wasn't an easy decision, and it certainly wasn't a pleasant experience. She resisted at first, her pride and shame clashing with my determination. But I didn't back down. I needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. The waiting period after the test was excruciating. Every day felt like an eternity, every hour filled with doubt and anxiety. I tried to distract myself with work, with friends, with anything that could take my mind off the situation. But no matter what I did, the thought of the test results was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. When the results finally came, I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me had already accepted the truth, but seeing it in black and white was still a shock. The child wasn't mine. The words on the paper were cold and clinical, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. All the doubts, all the fears, all the pain, it was all confirmed in that one sentence. I didn't know how to react. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, relief, even a strange sense of closure. But more than anything, I felt a deep, aching sense of loss. Not just for the relationship, but for the future I had imagined, the life I had built with her. It was all gone now, shattered by her lies and betrayal. I didn't confront her about the results right away. I needed time to process them, to figure out what they meant for me, for us. But when I finally did, it was clear that there was no going back. She tried to apologize, to explain herself, but I didn't want to hear it. The trust was gone, and without trust, there was nothing left to save. The days turned into weeks, and the reality of our situation began to sink in. We started the process of separating our lives, dividing our possessions, and figuring out the logistics of moving on. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the pain felt almost unbearable, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies, no matter how much it hurt to walk away. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave the house we had shared, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness for what we had lost. But I also felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, I was free from the lies, the betrayal, the constant doubt. It was a painful freedom, but it was freedom nonetheless. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I deserved better. And as hard as it was to walk away, I knew it was the only way to reclaim my life and my self-respect. The cheating wife may have frozen when she saw me that night, but in the end, it was her lies that left her out in the cold. The aftermath of the DNA test results was a strange mix of relief and devastation. On one hand, I finally had the clarity I had been searching for. The child wasn't mine, and that knowledge, as painful as it was, gave me a sense of closure. On the other hand, it solidified the end of everything I had believed in our marriage. Our future, the life we had built together. There was no going back now, no room for second chances or hopeful delusions. The truth was out, and it was as brutal as I had feared. The days that followed were a whirlwind of practicalities and emotional turmoil. We began the process of untangling our lives, a task that felt both necessary and surreal. dividing up possessions, deciding who would keep the house, and figuring out the logistics of separating our finances. It all felt so clinical, so detached from the emotional weight of what had happened. But it had to be done. Every box I packed, every item I set aside, felt like a small step toward reclaiming my life. She tried to talk to me a few times, her voice trembling with regret and desperation. She apologized, begged for forgiveness, and even suggested counseling, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Every word she spoke felt hollow, a feeble attempt to undo what had already been done. The trust between us was shattered, and no amount of apologies or promises could piece it back together. I had spent weeks, maybe even months, questioning myself, doubting my instincts, and trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But now, with the truth laid bare, I knew I had to stand firm. The hardest part was the quiet moments, the ones where the reality of what had happened would hit me like a tidal wave. I'd be going through the motions of my day, trying to focus on work or errands, and suddenly it would all come rushing back. The photos, the messages, the pregnancy test, the DNA results. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible, and the pain was relentless. I felt like I was mourning the loss of two people, the woman I thought I knew and the life I thought we had. Friends and family tried to offer support, but it was hard to let them in. How do you explain to someone that the person you trusted most in the world had betrayed you in the worst way possible? How do you articulate the mix of anger, sadness, and emptiness that comes with discovering your entire life was built on a lie? I appreciated their efforts, but I knew this was something I had to navigate on my own. As the weeks went by, I began to notice small shifts in how I felt. The raw, all-consuming pain started to dull, replaced by a quieter, more manageable ache. I started to find moments of peace, even if they were fleeting. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into anything that could distract me from the void her absence had left behind. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, but I kept pushing forward. One of the most unexpected challenges was dealing with the guilt. Not guilt over what had happened that was entirely on her, but guilt over how I was handling it. There were moments when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Maybe I should have given her a chance to explain, to make amends. But then I would remember the look on her face when I confronted her. The way she had frozen in the kitchen, the way she had complied when I told her to lift her dress. She knew what she had done, and she knew there was no coming back from it. The final straw came when I moved out of the house. It was a decision I had been putting off, partly out of practicality and partly out of a reluctance to let go. But I knew I couldn't stay there, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. The day I packed up my car and drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and a faint glimmer of hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I deserved better. I deserved a life built on trust, respect, and honesty, and as hard as it was to walk away, I knew it was the only way to reclaim my sense of self-worth. The cheating wife may have frozen when she saw me that night, but in the end it was her lies that left her out in the cold. I didn't know if she would ever truly understand the depth of the pain she had caused, but I knew I couldn't let that pain define me. I had to move forward, one step at a time, toward a future where I could trust again, where I could love again, and where I could finally find peace.